Hello all, I'm King John, you're you, and you're pretty cool. And I want to talk to you today on a subject that is near and dear to my heart. And this is a video I've been planning to make for a long time. It's needed to be made for a long time. Why the Sherman tank was the best tank of World War II. I can already hear the Veribus heads exploding as I'm talking. Now, there's an awful lot that is said about the Sherman tank that is simply not true. A lot of criticisms of the tank just are based on faulty evidence, incomplete information, or just plain wrong. For example, one thing I've heard repeated many times, even by supposedly professional historians on the History Channel and all, is that the Sherman tank was very likely to burn. And even more than that, the Sherman tank was very likely to burn if hit by enemy fire because it had a gasoline engine. Which is such an incredibly stupid thing to say. Because, yes, most American tanks did have gasoline engines. Some Sherman tanks were actually equipped with diesel engines. I'll get into that a little more later. So were British tanks. So were French tanks. So were German tanks. The fuel used is not the issue. Diesel engine tanks also burst into flame. You can find plenty of images and videos of Italian tanks and Russian tanks who did use diesel in their tank engines on fire or burned out. Now, when the Sherman tank was first deployed with the British 8th Army in the Western Desert, those particular tanks did have a tendency to burst into flames more often than most other tanks. It was found that the problem was that the ammunition stowage was faulty. They fixed that problem pretty quickly, and thereafter the Sherman tank was no more likely to burst into flame than any other tank, and actually less likely than many tanks. Another thing I don't like hearing about is people saying that the Sherman tank had bad armor. No, it did not. The Sherman tank had quite good armor for the time period. In fact, the armor on the Sherman tank was just as thick as the German Panzer IV or the Russian T-34. Although, compared to the T-34, the Sherman tank actually had much higher quality armor. Much better made armor. If you want more detail about the faults of the T-34's armor, I suggest a YouTuber called LaserPig, who did a video about the T-34, and it's pretty funny. See, where was I? Right, burst into flames, and then not burst. Right. So, the people who like the Sherman tank, who praise it, they always talk about logistics. And yeah, that is a very important topic, and the Sherman tank, logistically, was a very good tank. Logistically, the best tank of the war, without question. It was specifically made to be good logistically, to be easy to build, to be easy to transport, relatively, it's still a tank. Easy to maintain, again, relatively, still a tank. This was, But there's more than that. There's a lot more than that. Even LaserPig, who I've really enjoyed his videos on tanks, he did a video at the British Tank Museum. He was talking a little about the Sherman tank. Even he talked about the logistics of it, but not. I'll get into that later. Okay, so Sherman tank, logistically great. It was fast. It was a very fast tank. It was very reliable. It was easy to maintain. Very mobile. It could travel on all kinds of terrain. And then there's the big part. The part that somehow, almost literally, everybody has missed. Now, another YouTuber called Military History Visualized actually did a video on the gun of the Sherman tank, about how it was a good gun. And I was very happy to see him make that video, and I gotta talk about it too, because, anyway. The gun carried by the Sherman tank was the best gun carried by any tank in the Second World War. Pause for very boost heads to explode. Right. So, I'll stop here for a moment and ask you, if you disagree with that, tell me what gun you think was the best tank gun of the Second World War. Comment below, and pause this video, comment below, and then hear what I have to say. You back? Cool. So, the big complaint that people make about the gun carried by the Sherman tank, I'm not talking about the 90mm, I'm not talking about the 76, I'm talking about the short-barreled 75. That was the best tank gun of the war. I probably should have said that before asking you to pause and comment with that, whatever. They always say it couldn't penetrate, it was terrible at armor penetration. Well, the obvious response to that is, compared to what? Because when the Sherman tank was first came out on the battlefield, when that 75mm first came on the battlefield, it was a very good gun. On the M3 Lee, on the M4 Sherman, it was very effective against German armor in North Africa. It's the same caliber as the I was going to compare it to the T-34. I shouldn't do that. It was right out to the end of the war. The short-barreled 75 remained an effective weapon against almost every single AFV fielded by the Axis powers. Anything the Japanese used, it could kill. Anything the Italians used, it could kill. Any of the minor Axis powers, it killed any of their tanks. The German army, fighting the German army, any AFV they were likely to run into, Panzer IIIs, Panzer IVs, Stugs, Pumas, anything they were likely to run into, the short-barreled 75 was a highly effective weapon against them. It was only the German heavy tanks, the ones that were produced in very limited numbers, incidentally, that could be said to be, the 75 could be said to be ineffective against. And even those, it was effective against even the Tiger tanks. It was effective against them at short to medium combat ranges, depending on the angle. But even talking about that is just veering off from the actual topic, the actual subject of this conversation, because tanks historically almost never fight tanks. And when I say historically, I mean right up to the Ukraine war. I mean, even now, the vast majority of tanks in that war are being used as infantry support, which, incidentally, is the exact reason why tanks were invented in the first place. So tanks fighting enemy tanks is the exception, not the rule. So what are tanks shooting at most of the time? Well, after the Second World War, an American general got curious, and you'd be surprised how many things we know today that start with exactly that sentence. An American general got curious after the Second World War. And so this particular general, I don't remember his name at the moment, he did a study to find out what tanks were shooting at. And he found that tanks were shooting at enemy armored fighting vehicles, that's tanks, half-tracks, armored cars, 14.7% of the time. That means that armor penetration actually counted 14.7% of all shots fired by tanks. Now the other 85.3% of the time, tanks were shooting at infantry, unarmored vehicles, buildings, fortifications, artillery, all things that armor penetration doesn't help with. All things that instead you use high explosive shells to shoot at. So the Sherman tank, the short-barreled 75 carried by the Sherman tank, had the best, the most effective high explosive shell of any tank gun in the war. Now, what I mean by best and most effective, I mean it carried the most weight of high explosives and created the most shrapnel, on average at least, compared to any other shell fired by any tank gun. Now, that is in part because of the big weakness of the 75, its low armor penetration, because it was a low caliber gun. Now, a high caliber gun, like the German 88, which was a much bigger gun than the short barrel 75 and fired a much bigger shell, but the 88 was a high explosive gun, high pressure gun, and so the shells that it fired needed very thick steel walls to prevent the high explosive inside them from exploding in the barrel. So even though the 75 millimeter shell was much smaller than the 88 millimeter shell, it could still carry a much higher weight of explosives. So 85.3% of the time, a Sherman tank crew armed with a 75 millimeter had the best, the most effective gun of any tank in the war, and 14.7% of the time they had a gun that was effective against the vast majority of targets they were likely to face. So that's it. Okay, alright, I want to back up. The Sherman tank did have one major weakness, and that was it was a very tall tank. And height matters a lot in armored warfare, because a taller tank is easier to spot, it's harder to hide, and it's a big deal. Now, the reason why the Sherman tank was so tall is part of the reason why the Sherman tank was such an effective tank and lasted for such a long time. Sherman tanks remained in service for right into the 21st century, at least in some variants in some countries. And that was the Sherman tank did not have an engine deck like other tanks do. Almost all tanks you see are built around a particular engine. Literally built around it. Like a tank is specifically built to accept a specific engine, and if you want to change it to a different engine, you need to redesign and rebuild the tank. Not the Sherman. See, the Sherman tank doesn't have an engine deck. It has a big empty space at the back where you can just open it up and shove an engine in and bolt it down to the deck. And that's it. And so that's why the Sherman tank is so tall. But it's also a really big advantage, because I said earlier that some Sherman tanks did have diesel engines. You could engine a Sherman tank with just about anything. And they did. For example, they used old aircraft engines. Like the aircraft engines were no longer weren't modern anymore for aircraft. They're still very powerful engines, and with a very high power to weight ratio, and could be used very effectively in tanks. Now, America was almost alone in being able to do that, because all other countries didn't have the giant space at the back for whatever engine you had available. Now, this was part of why the Sherman was so effective, because it was very easy to maintain any engine on the Sherman tank. You just open it up, go in, and do whatever you needed to do. Whereas if the engine of a Panzer IV broke down, you had to open it up and lift the entire engine out of the tank and possibly take it apart to work on it, and then put it all back in. And this is part of the longevity of the Sherman tank, because it's very easy to re-engine. Okay? T-34s were used for a long time after the Second World War, but for a very long time, the only times they were ever used in combat was in static positions. Like, they would be towed to someplace and left there because they couldn't move. Their engines were so worn out, you couldn't use them as actual tanks anymore. Whereas the Sherman tanks, they were so easy to re-engine. They were just that some countries, like Israel, just kept just changing the engines of their tanks, just re-engine them and re-engine them, giving them more power, more power to rate ratio, more whatever, replacing them when they broke down. It was so easy. Speaking of so easy, the Sherman tank was also so easy to modify. You could re-engine it, you could upgun it, you could turn it into all kinds of engineering vehicles, which is well, the last several decades of Sherman tank service was as engineering vehicles, being used across the world. So I was a little less jointed than I wanted to do it, but I think I said everything I wanted to say. Yeah, I think so. Sherman tank, best tank of the Second World War. Fast, reliable, great gun, good. Just look at the longevity of service. Okay, over 50 years after the Second World War, Sherman tanks were still in service across the world. No other tank can match that. Anyway, so I think that's all I had to say. I think I said that already. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please comment below with anything you have to say. I'd really like to know what you think. And have a good day, and God bless.